Just a sec guys, the Bloody Roar 3 V-Jump interview just came back from the shop and the engine needs to cool for a bit. Compared with the Bloody Roar 2 V-Jump interview, which we covered in a previous video, this time around series director Kenji Fukuya spoke much more about in-game mechanics and waxed philosophical about getting people to understand Bloody Roar's appeal. That doesn't mean there's nothing worth talking about though. Quite the opposite. When you think of basic controls for a fighting game, what do the buttons do? Assuming you're playing as a human or human-like entity, you'd assume there's a way to punch, kick, and block. Bloody Roar has all three of those plus a beast button. But in an effort to make the game more streamlined and accessible, Fukuya said they considered getting rid of the guard button entirely. For this particular series, that isn't as ridiculous as it sounds. Light guard is active by simply not pressing anything, and heavy guard can become active by holding the direction away from the opponent. That does beg the question of what the guard button would do if it weren't a guard button. Would it simply become the throw button? That's what I'm thinking. It's hard to imagine that there would be an unused face button on the controller, and they would go back to pressing punch and kick at the same time to throw someone, particularly if the idea was to become more accessible. Along the same lines of gaining wider appeal, Fukuya mentioned some ideas he had for this that didn't make it into the game. For example, as part of the added utility to the beast form, Fukuya wanted to add an ultimate power-up of sorts, one that would allow novice players a chance to clutch out a win against more experienced and skilled players. This sounds like Kenji was playing a lot of Smash Bros. With items turned on. You know, the way the game was meant to be played. As for something that did make it into the game, he mentioned that being low on health in human form would make each attack fill the beast gauge more than usual. In addition, there's the red bar behind the life bar that can be refilled by performing a beast drive, regardless of whether it hits or not. That, on top of the Hyper Beast form in general, was part of an effort to make beast form use more tactical. Personally, while I don't like the idea of being rewarded for missing a beast drive on purpose, something players will do a lot to regain health, I think it ultimately is a way to help achieve the stated goal. There was also the decision to replace guard escape with evading, with the idea that it would allow quick decision making by the player. Fukuya thought that guard escape, a mechanic which allows a fighter to avoid an attack and shift on the Z-axis, hurt the balance of the game. Damn, if only there was another 3D fighter out there that made effective use of Z-axis movement while avoiding attacks. I guess it doesn't exist. He mentioned sidestep being useful for not getting pinned in a corner or against a wall, but in practice it's only particularly useful for cheesing the AI from a distance. There's no active guard for sidestepping, so trying to do it against human players simply won't work because they won't get fooled by it. And doing it against AI or human players up close usually just ends in tragedy. Fukuya said that with the jump to the PS2 they could add a lot more to the game, which would have been true if Bloody Roar 3 was on a PS2 DVD, but it was printed on a PS2 compact disc. Still has a bit of extra space, but nowhere near as much. He was worried that if they added one idea after the other, the game would snowball into some really niche, overly core-focused mess that only appealed to veteran players. And because I know there's a subset of people out there who get their fight sticks in a knot over this kind of talk, let's put this into perspective. There's a tendency for people involved with the competitive scenes of fighting games to both overestimate their own share of a game's total audience and completely lose sight of a game's appeal outside of its more sophisticated mechanics. I've seen this happen with games that sold millions of copies and games that sold tens of thousands of copies. Having some casual elements in a fighting game can both boost its short-term gain through more immediate sales and appeal, and boost its odds at long-term survival by looking more viable as a franchise to whoever's behind it. Just to name a few examples for the former, Guilty Gear is a long-running franchise that had a significant showing at this year's EVO tournament for its newest entry, Guilty Gear Strive, with just under 2,500 people entering. Strive's total sales? Over 2.5 million copies. If we're being generous in saying that the entry list is only about 5% of the game's competitive scene, or about 50,000 people, That means the competitive players only account for less than 2% of Strive's total audience. It's even smaller when you try this for games like Tekken 7, where about 1,500 people registered for the EVO tournament while the game itself sold over 10 million copies, meaning the competitive scene would represent less than 0.3% of its total player base. But what about for a brand new game with a really hot competitive scene? Street Fighter VI. While naturally having a more inflated entry number, there were 7,061 entries for this game, which sold more than 2 million copies. As of my recording this, that 2 million number is extremely out of date. But even if it weren't, with the 5% trick, the competitive scene represents less than 7% of the game's total player base. Even if we go nuts and say that the entries are only 1% of the game's competitive scene, it still only represents about 1/3 of Street Fighter VI's total player base. This is not suggesting that the input of a competitive scene or veteran players doesn't matter. Hell, part of the reason Bloody Roar is still in the public conscious at all is because it showed up in a few tournaments recently. But without the more than 90% of the audience for a game that doesn't play competitively, how much of a scene do you have? Let's change the subject, shall we? Because Kenji had some weird things to say about the new characters. The first thing Fukuya mentioned was the desire to have a rival character for Yugo, and they specifically wanted someone with an anti-hero image, which turned out to be Xion. I don't know about you, but I do not miss this period of video games where it felt like every other series tried to add anti-hero characters, regardless of whether they actually fit in their respective games or environments. Oddly, Kenji did not say anything about Xion's beast form aside from it being powerful. I was hoping for some explanation of why they thought crossing Guyver with a bottle of Crystal Pepsi was the way to go, but nope, not a word. Then again, Fukuya said that having the first Bakuryu's remains mopped up and used to build a mole cyborg was a natural direction to take. Kenji, robots are inherently unnatural. What are you talking about? And then there was Uranus, a character he described as someone the players can choose to work out their frustrations. Calling her someone that is visceral but immediately fun, Fukuya said Uranus actually helped people understand Bloody Roar's appeal. But wait, Uranus can't be unlocked without beating arcade mode with no continues or making it through several rounds of survival and then defeating her. Who reaches that point without being at least somewhat interested in the game? Or is this the fighting game equivalent of an RPG fan who says, yeah, it starts off dull and the characters aren't interesting and the combat's pretty jank, but once you're about 40 hours in, it really hits its stride. One thing Kenji Fukuya is a series director for a fighting game. He is definitely not a fortune teller. Here he states that he still wants his elephant zoanthrope, which appears in the Bloody Roar game that follows.
Gentlemen, I am not leaving without my elephant.
And he wanted to make Hyper Beast more dynamic by having it trigger special abilities for each character. This was sort of accomplished in Bloody Roar Extreme, although there are a number of abilities that are shared by multiple characters. That's it. That's all the things he said that actually came true. Now for everything else. Aside from an elephant, he mentioned wanting to add a buffalo zoanthrope. As in the animal, not the city.
Buffalo all the way this time!
Kenji also wanted to have Hyper Beast mode change the character model when activated. The closest we got to that is Kronos' Phoenix form in Extreme, and someone using half a dozen Adobe Premiere filters over the top of the Beast models. Finally, Fukuya changed his mind about wanting to make 3 Bloody Roar games and a special edition of some sort. Now he says he wants to make Bloody Roar games forever, saying there's no end to how the series could evolve. If he only knew. As before, the full translation of the interview can be found at shmuplations.com, and the link to it is in the description. But there's a little something else from outside this interview and outside of the V-Jump book entirely. Back in 2001, a fan poll was run for what beast forms to add to the series on BloodyRoar.com, the site used for series news and information from Bloody Roar 3 onward. Fans could suggest anything, and similar ideas would be grouped together, with ranks given for how popular each suggestion was. The final results were as follows, from 10th place up to 1st place. Snake, Dinosaur/T-Rex, what, like the one in the museum? Technically, we already got that in some form. Kangaroo, Elephant/Mammoth, which I like to think was just Kenji voting for his own idea multiple times. Bears of various kinds, Kitsune, which may have just been fans who wanted Fox to return. Penguin, one of the 4 symbols of Chinese astrology, a bird of some kind, and at the top of the list, a dragon. The rest of the suggestions are a hodgepodge of random ideas, some totally doable, some completely impractical, some just downright weird, and then there's someone who just suggested human as a beast form. I don't know if that's thinking outside the box or a total lack of imagination, but remember how Fukuya said he found regular human versus human fighters boring? I wonder how he feels about human versus zoanthrope fights, or what he would do to avoid that becoming completely one-sided. I'm imagining a human character trying to fight zoanthropes with something like the power loader from Alien. The weird ones include cryptids like the chupacabra, someone asking for a zombie, someone asking for a deep one a la H.P. Lovecraft, various insects that would almost certainly become nightmare fuel, some guy asking for an angel, probably in more ways than one, and a long list of mythology-based creatures from all over the world. Japanese, Chinese, Greek, and Egyptian names all show up in this list. You know what else someone suggested? A crab. Crab! And yes, someone who may or may not be Kenji Fukuya again also suggested a buffalo. It's important to note that at the time of this interview after the fan poll, Fukuya said the next Bloody Roar game was still in the planning stages, to the point that he didn't know the release window or even what console it would be on. On top of his unrelenting quest to add an elephant zoanthrope, other people on the dev team wanted to add either a snake or a shark zoanthrope. Technically, there was a shark zoanthrope in the background of a scene in Bloody Roar 2. Maybe that was a sign this whole time. Anyway, Fukuya said that the bear and kangaroo sounded like good ideas, but there would be some overlap with a certain other fighting game. Obviously, he's talking about Metamorphic Force for the bear and Streets of Rage 3 for the kangaroo. Obviously. For the penguin, he said it would be odd to have a beast form that made someone smaller, and mused about the potential for underwater combat. It seems pretty clear from this that Kronos wasn't even partially conceptualized yet. On a related note, the 4 symbols of Chinese mythology mentioned earlier, one of them is a phoenix. As for the bird idea, Fukuya said that the team discussed adding another beast form capable of aerial combat to build off of what Jenny brought to the table. This became a reality with Kronos' phoenix form in Extreme, as well as Reiji's crow form in Bloody Roar 4. I'm gonna go out on a limb and assume that Fukuya did not want the crow form to cause massive slowdown in some of the levels. And then there was the most popular suggestion, a dragon. Proof positive that sometimes fans really don't know what's best for a series. Fukuya mentioned that Caramel Mama, the group that did art and story work for the earlier Bloody Roar games, produced concepts for a dragon character as far back as the first game. But he and the rest of the team were worried that such a character would be way too strong and overwhelm the game. Lo and behold, a dragon character showed up in Bloody Roar 4 and he was absolutely right. I'll go more in depth on how he was right at a later time. Still, Fukuya called adding a dragon character to Bloody Roar a no-brainer. I'd like to point out that there's a photo of Kenji here with a caption describing him as a hard drinker from Hokkaido. Make of that what you will. Next time, for the final V-Jump interview in this short little video series, Fukuya dishes on Bloody Roar Extreme/Primal Fury, explaining why it's on the GameCube, where it sits in the Bloody Roar timeline, the approach to some characters' designs, and a dragon character. It should have been a crab, damn it.